have two presentations. The idea of today's seminar is to, discuss a little bit our results on potential impacts or implications of the pandemic on public opinion in Spain and Italy. So, as Pierangelo said, Jordi, who is associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Barcelona. Actually, the whole crew is from the University of Barcelona. So Francesca Matt, Andrea Arenas, Albert Falcon, Jimeno have written this paper based on panel data and experiments. And so the idea is to see whether there's been an impact on support for democracy or public preferences on how to manage the crisis, while the other paper, the second one, who will be presented by Gianni Betti, who is full professor from the Department of Economics and Statistics from the University of Siena, is more on the trade-off between health and wealth. So what preferences Italians hold with respect to potential policy intervention when tackling addressing the problem, and also about the consequences in terms of health and wealth. This is with respect to the first part. Then we will have the discussion, hopefully many questions. As Pierangelo said, just write the question or ask me to intervene in the Gmeet chat, which is on the top right corner. That's it. I don't know if Paolo Bellucci was supposed to join us, who is the president of the CIRCaP. Anyhow, we can start. So I would leave the floor to Jordi and then to Gianni. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting us to discuss our work, and we are glad to be able also to learn more about the work you are doing in Italy. And I think it's an interesting comparison to do these days between Spain and Italy. So I'm sure we will learn many things. I'm gonna try to share my screen with the presentation. So well, I need to give permission. Just 1 minute, because it's asking me to give permission to share the screen.
Usually there should be no request.
Yeah, let me do this in 1 second. Okay. Okay, you hear me now?
Yes. You can see the presentation.
And you can see the presentation. Okay, that's good.
Yes.
So yeah, so this is joint work with Francesc, Andreu, and Albert, who are also with us today from the University of Barcelona. We are a mixed team of 1 economist and 3 political scientists, but working on close topics. So this is a paper that came out from a survey we conducted right at the beginning of the lockdown in Spain, following up a previous survey we had run with some experiments in January. So where we had some questions that we thought it would be useful as a baseline to have like a baseline scenario for a baseline measure for some of the things we are trying to analyze. So let's go with the full screen mode. So the motivation, of course, and I think I don't need to explain this for long, is that we think that these pandemics and the accompanying policy responses represent an unprecedented challenge for our democracies, in the sense that they pose some, like, several dilemmas, and some of them are the ones we analyze in this paper. There's first a dilemma between the national and global management of the pandemic, in the sense that this is a global threat. The decisions taken by one country have obvious externalities on what happens in other places of the world, and so on and so forth. But the response has been mainly national, and our national governments who are responsible for, like, border control or health systems, and so on and so forth. And there is a tension here between the global and national dimension of the issue. Of course, there's a tension.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Jordi, if I interrupt you, but somebody is telling me that he can't see the full screen. So we are on
They
the first
can't-
slide, but we know full screen only.
Okay. And now? Is it better
Now I
now?
can see the second one, but still it's not full screen. So I don't know if you.
Okay, but if it works this way, what is important is that we can see the slides as you
Yeah,
move on.
yeah, because I had it in full screen, but apparently it was not moving.
It was not shared the full
So-
screen, but it's okay
Yeah,
like this.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Let's go on.
Is it too small to?
For me, no.
Okay.
No,
So-
we can see clearly. I don't know those who are on stream, but we can see it clearly.
Okay. So I was saying that there are a set of dilemmas this crisis poses and we think they are important to try to address and understand from a political science perspective. So one dilemma between national and global management of the pandemics. The other rather obvious one is between the protection of health and individual freedoms. And there is a third one between, like, regular party politics and technocratic governments. These are the dilemmas we address in this paper, using a combination of methods. On one hand, we have this panel survey, in which we use a survey fielded in January as a baseline before the crisis started. We had a second wave in March, and we have a third wave that is about to go to the field this week. Okay, so we have, like, 3 waves by the moment, separated by 2 months each, more or less. And in the second wave, we expanded the sample and we added a set of survey experiments, which I will discuss in more detail later. So as a preview of our results, we find first high support for a national management of the crisis as opposed to a European management of the crisis. So it seems that in the first dilemma, there's a quite large consensus in the Spanish public opinion in that they tend to prefer a national management of the crisis. Whether this is endogenous to the institutional responses to the crisis, this is something that we could discuss, because we have some thoughts about it, but we have not fully developed them. The second main result is that exposure to the COVID, and this is purely correlational, not causal evidence, but we find that those that were more exposed to the pandemic, at least in the first stages of the crisis, show lower levels of institutional trust and lower levels of democratic support. And we also document a sizable increase in technocratic preferences between January and March, an increase in technocratic preferences that is more pronounced among those that were more exposed to the pandemics, using a measure that we can discuss later of exposure. And we also find a very widely shared willingness to trade off individual freedom for protection against the virus. So this is a quick summary. The theory that is behind our empirical exercise is one in which we have a political system that is exposed to a very strong negative shock, okay, that negatively affects citizens' welfare, and the question is how this can affect the political system and citizens' support and preferences for different modes of governance. So we try to go beyond the question of whether the incumbents are benefited or punished by the crisis, and focus on the more systemic effects. Right. So there's this idea in the literature, and here we cite one example from Matsumoglu and Robinson, but it has been like suggested by many pieces that these exogenous negative shocks, in the case of authoritarian regimes, for example, have the potential to open windows of opportunity for democratization. When this happens, when this type of shocks happen in a democracy, it cannot, of course, also be potentially destabilizing for the political system. And there's evidence out there on things like earthquakes or floods or these kind of things that show how citizens' preferences for democratic governance were weaker after the shock. Okay. Another question is the duration of the effects, and this is something we want to investigate with the upcoming waves of our panel. Okay, the idea, our intuition, however, is that even if this is a short-term shock, this might be important nonetheless, because and this is where this concept of window of opportunity kicks in, right? So we have our intuition is that you have a crisis, a negative shock, even if it's short-lived, even if it moves citizens' preferences only temporarily towards more demand for strong government, technocracy, and so on and so forth. Some would-be authoritarian leaders could take advantage of this situation and shift the political equilibrium to one with less civil liberties and more authoritarian governments. And I think, for example, the case of Hungary is a case in point here, where the government used the emergency powers related to the pandemic to strengthen its power vis-a-vis the legislative and be able to govern by decree. Or something we are seeing, for example, these days in the US are also a case in point here, in the sense that, for example, in some cities, we have read reports that they are using the contact tracing technology that was set up for the pandemic control to control the demonstrations and the lootings and so on and so forth, right? So we have a situation in which you have this shock, and some institutions change, and the executive gains more powers, and this, if the political leaders want, they can take advantage of the situation to strengthen their position vis-a-vis the citizens and the other institutions, shifting the political equilibrium. So this is like a brief description of the intuitions we have behind our exercise. So the data is, as I was saying before, a panel survey that we fielded in late January, the first wave, and the second wave in March. So we have 820 respondents interviewed in the two waves. In the March wave, we expanded we doubled the sample size, and also added new questions and a set of survey experiments that I will be presenting. The third wave is currently about to go into the field for May, and we are also planning to have further waves, but this will be conditional to our ability to secure funding for this study. So these sources of data allow us to combine different empirical strategies, right? In the first place, we have the panel models with individual fixed effects that allow us to identify changes in preferences over time within individual changes in preferences between before and after the crisis, and we can interact this with some characteristics of the individuals to observe like heterogeneous effects. The second strategy is the set of survey experiments in which we randomly assign different frames and different threads. And the third strategy, of course, is some correlational evidence based on the cross-sectional survey in the second wave. So I'm going to go through the different dilemmas I was discussing before. If there's a question, you can just interrupt me if you need some clarification. But so we are going to look first to the European versus national response, second to the effects of exposure to the crisis on political trust, third to preferences for technocratic governance, and fourth to the question of the restriction of civil liberties linked to the control of the pandemics. So first, regarding the scope of the crisis management, we have this small experiment in which we tell our respondents, imagine that you have a 1,000 euro bonus and you receive this bonus and you are asked to contribute the quantity that you want to different funds to control the pandemic, okay, in your region, in Spain, in Europe, or in Asia. And we look at the differences across geographical points of references. As one could expect, we find more willingness to contribute when the question refers to your own region or Spain. There are no significant differences between the two. It's around 500 euros. When the question refers to Europe, however, we see a drop of 100 euros. Okay, so on average, our respondents were willing to contribute 400 euros to COVID control in Europe as opposed to 500 in Spain. And when the question was referred to Asia, it was about 320 euros approximately. Okay, so there is a significant and sizable decrease in the willingness to contribute, which is something that you could expect, I would say. More interestingly, in this second experiment, we look at the willingness to transfer powers to the European Union, to the national government, to handle the crisis. And here the strategy is to compare the COVID crisis to other similar global threats in a way, right? So they are, of course, all different, but they share some characteristics. That there are some similarities in the sense that they are global problems that negatively affect citizens' welfare. And one is the climate change, and the other one is international terrorism. Okay, so we compare responses to these three randomly assigned threats. Okay, so each respondent only sees one of these. So they all see the same questions, but referring to one of these three threats. And here we find interesting differences. And clearly, the COVID crisis is the crisis in which there is less willingness to transfer powers to the European Union among the Spanish population. In this scale from 0 to 7, on average, the average is 5, and for the other two crises, the average is 6. In the case of the transferring powers to the Spanish government, we find the opposite. Okay, we find an average of around 6 for the COVID crisis and an average of around 5 for the other two crises, which points to this preference for, sorry, it's a 0-10 scale. These clear preferences for national management of the crisis. If we look at the relationship between our measure of exposure to the pandemics and political trust, we observe that those citizens that declare to be more exposed to the COVID, and by exposed here we mean whether they had been sick themselves or someone in their close family or friends had been sick, those people show significantly lower levels of trust in the Spanish government, in the European Union, and also more preferences for an authoritarian response and less support for democracy. The magnitude of the effects in the case of trust is much higher than in the other two outcomes, but nonetheless we have significant results that go in the same direction. Of course, I insist that this is purely correlational evidence, but we think it's suggestive of something going on here, like exposure to the pandemics, creating this demand or support for more authoritarian response and eroding trust in the established institutions. Here we show the results with regards to technocracy and preferences for technocracy. We have three outcome variables here, three items that we think reasonably tap into what we understand as technocratic governance. And here, these estimates come from these individual fixed effects models, comparing the January and March waves. We find that there is a significant increase in agreement with the willingness to vote a good manager rather than someone who represents my ideology. This is the first item. The second item asks whether people agree with the statement that politicians should address public issues technically rather than ideologically. And here we also see a perhaps smaller but still significant increase. And we think that given that this is within individual changes, so these models have individual fixed effects and there are only 2 months of difference, we think that the fact of finding these differences is important. And then the third item, which is where people think that's better to have experts rather than politicians deciding the best policies, we also find a significant increase, a significant move towards pro-technocratic attitudes among our respondents. So everything seems to point in the same direction. People more exposure to the crisis seems to reinforce preference for more authoritarian governance, more technocratic governance, and less trust in the existing institutions. Here we address this a bit more directly, and we also focus on the other dimension of the problem, which is the individual liberties and civil liberties. And here we find perhaps what I would say are the most striking results in our exercise, which is that the willingness to sacrifice individual liberties in exchange for protection against the virus is super high, right? And it's much higher than, for example, the willingness to sacrifice individual liberties to help fight climate change or international terrorism. On this 0-10 scale, on average, our respondents are placed at 8 in the willingness to sacrifice individual liberties, and a similar thing happens with the idea that we should unite around a strong leader to face this pandemic. And this agreement is high for all 3 threats with this second item, but it is especially high for the COVID crisis. Now, this might be related to the salience of the problem in the moment in which we run the survey, and this is why we think it's important to keep the panel going on for at least 1 more year in order to see to what extent this is driven by like the immediate context of the moment, or is a more long-term shift of preferences. Although our intuition is that even if it's a short-term change, it can be politically relevant and important. Here we have finally a last experiment in which we simply compare 2 different framings of the crisis. What we call the cooperation or cooperative frame versus the discipline frame. The idea is to see which one elicits more agreement among our respondents. So the first item was we must all cooperate to combat the virus, or we must all be disciplined to combat the virus. And we see very small differences, quantitatively small differences. Statistically, they are significant, however, in the direction of people agreeing more to the discipline frame than the cooperation one. And we also see people agreeing more with the idea that we should follow authorities' orders to mitigate the coronavirus rather than trust experts' indication. So there seems to be something there slightly biased towards the disciplined frame and following authorities' orders, but the differences are not that large in this experiment. So just concluding, we have documented a strong preferences for national management of the crisis, which is congruent with what has actually happened, at least in Spain, where the response has been strongly centralized by the central government, and both the European Union and the autonomous regions have played, at least in the key issues, a rather secondary role. We have seen also a negative correlation between self-reported exposure and trust. We have seen a sharp increase in technocratic preferences that was more pronounced among those most affected by the virus, and also those with lower levels of political information, and this is something I didn't mention before. And we also find a very widespread willingness to accept union around a strong leader and training of civil liberties for protection against the virus. So the implications of this are a bit provisional at this moment, but our intuitions are that this crisis may be dangerous for democracy through at least through two different channels. The one would be a very direct change in preferences that comes to stay, right? So following this threat and this experience with the crisis, citizens may update their beliefs about the ability of democratic systems to provide protection against the virus, so to protect their lives in a way. And this could weaken, if there is a massive negative update of beliefs, this could weaken support for democratic governance. And we have seen some people praising, for example, China's response to the pandemics, or other examples of very authoritarian measures taken in some countries. But there's also this indirect channel I was mentioning before, in which the crisis has only short-term effects, but this provides these could-be authoritarian leaders with a window of opportunity to enact special powers and curtail civil liberties with little opposition. And this shift, this authoritarian shift, even if it was conceived to be introduced only for the management of the crisis, might come to stay in a way, or might contribute to a new political equilibrium. We think, as I was mentioning before, that it is important to assess the duration of the effects we have documented, and this is why we have the third wave of the survey on the field, and we are filling some grant applications to get funding and continue this research. So this was my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. So, now I'll be happy to answer questions.
So thank you very much, Jordi. Very informative presentation, very clear. And I would leave the floor to Gianni first, and then we collect the questions. I mean, this is all between us. So, I mean, we can have the discussion at the end. Thank you very much, Jordi. And please, Gianni, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, clearly.
Okay. So good afternoon to everybody. And thank you, Sergio, for your kind introduction you did before. As you can see, I'm going to present a joint paper prepared with Linda, Rossella, Mattia, Pierangelo, Sergio, Francesco, and Paolo. So a long list of co-authors. My presentation will cover the following points. So after having briefly presented the scope of the paper, I will show the experiment. Then I will present very briefly the survey, which has been conducted a little bit later compared to the Spanish case. In fact, it was conducted at the end of April, and it was a cross-sectional survey. And then I will show some results. Three types of regression models. The first one, what we call a Bayes regression. Then other models where some controls, some control variables have been added. And then a model that we find interesting on the behavior of the so-called sovereignist in Italy. And then I will quickly conclude my presentation. So after the very interesting case of Spain, here we analyze Italy using two survey experiments. In the paper, we cover both of them, while in my presentation I will focus on the second experiment only. The first experiment is a framing experiment along the lines of the Asian flu experiment, which is based on the effects on unemployment and deaths due to COVID-19. The second one is a discrete choice experiment on alternative scenarios of lockdown from one side and opening from the other. Well, in the talking about this second experiment, we showed to people two possible scenarios. What we call the scenario A is reopening as soon as possible, and the scenario B is to keep continuing the lockdown that was present in the month of April during the survey. We also included some numbers to both scenarios in 4 different dimensions, and all these figures were based in a particular month, so the month of May 2020. So we showed some expected number of deaths in the month of May, GDP loss in billions of euro, loss of job places in the economy, and finally the percentage of beds in intensive therapy, so ICU beds, devoted to COVID-19. So here in this table, you can see the two scenarios, A and B, in the columns, and in the row you can see the four dimensions. 2 dimensions are relative to health, so deaths in the month of May and the percentage of beds in intensive therapy, and the other 2 dimensions were in terms of wealth, in terms of economy, so GDP loss and loss in employment. As you can see, each respondent faced only 2 possibilities out of 4. So from a health point of view, we can see some hard and mild A scenario and some hard and mild B scenario. So you can see mainly in these in terms of health conditions. So this is the hard scenario, and this is mild compared to A1. This is the hard scenario, and this is the mild compared to the hard scenario. So this assignment was based on a randomization and with 4 treatments. So the treatment were the 4 combination A1 and B1, so hard and hard, A1, B2, so hard A and mild B, then A2, B1, so you can reverse, mild A and hard B, and finally A2, B2, where you can have both mild conditions in the scenario. So this is merely the description of what I have already said. So the survey was the fieldwork was conducted at the end of April, in the week between 24th and 28th of April, and the gross sample was about 1,760 individuals. However, in our analysis, we have not taken into account the so-called speeder respondents. So eliminating those who filled the questionnaire too quickly, we end out with 1,562 individuals. Those individuals, so this sample has been calibrated to the Italian internet population according to some post-stratification weights. So here we have some figures about the answers in each one of the 4 different treatments. So the treatment A2B1, so mild hard, is clearly the most favorable for the reopening option A. In fact, as you can see, it has the highest percentage of weighted respondents voting for reopening. In all the other scenarios, the majority voted for lockdown, even if the percentages were not much higher. So the treatment A2B1, as we said, is the most favorable for the reopening option A. So for our first set of models, which are based on logistic regression and which we called Bayes models, we take as control treatment A2B1, which, as we saw from the previous slide, is the most favorable for the reopening option A. And we consider the effect of the other 3 treatments. So given their randomization procedure, these from an economic and an experiment point of view, this shows the causality effect of framing on the decision of our subjects. So here some interesting results, at least from our point of view, from this first Bayes logistic regression model. So what we can see from this table is that in the control treatment A2B1, the probability of choosing scenario B could be calculated with the estimate of the intercept. In fact, if we calculate, and I show you in the next slide, if we calculate 1 divided by 1 plus the e to the value 0.23, we get exactly the 44.1% that we already saw in this slide. So this percentage of choosing a scenario B is much increased in the other 3 treatments. In particular, we can see that this difference is very, very, very significant, with 99% confidence interval for all of the 3 treatments. So by using these estimates, this parameter, and putting in the formula coming from the logistic regression, we can calculate exactly the probability of choosing scenario B in experiment in treatment A1B2, which is about 64%.
Sorry if I interrupt you. Cristiano has a question for you. If you could please repeat the various combinations. Is
okay.
Cristiano?
Okay, so I go back to
Thank you.
This table is correct. So here we have in scenario A, we have oh, sorry, because I can only see my presentation, so I cannot see questions. So please do interrupt me. So in scenario A, we have the hard situation. So this is A1. Hard because we have 2,000, an expected number of 2,000 deaths, and 60% of percentage of beds in intensive therapy occupied by COVID-19. A2 is a little bit milder, so we have half of the deaths, and we have 30% of beds in intensive therapy. For scenario B, so keeping the lockdown, we have a harder scenario with still 5,000 deaths and still some beds occupied, and this is the mildest in scenario B of continuing the lockdown. So only 2,000 deaths and 5% beds occupied by intense therapy. Okay?
Okay, great. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, so going ahead, so here this basic logistic regression model can tell us if there are significant effects among the treatments, and of course there are. The main interpretation of these outcomes is that showing a harder reopening scenario has the biggest impact of people's choices. So those are the coefficients of A1B2 and A1B1, while an attenuation of the lockdown scenario is less effective. But here we could go down further. But we want to see also the other two sets of models. So in the second set of logistic regression models, we started to introduce some control variables. Which control variables we introduced? Well, we estimated really many models, but however, we wanted to test mainly control variables, which, according to the recent literature, should be more pivotal in the choice between a lockdown and a reopening. So very quickly, I will show this table full of numbers, but in our perspective is quite interesting. So apart from the treatment, we inserted people, so a dummy for people living in Lombardy region and voting right. Voting right means that in a scale between 0 and 10, so starting from the left 0 and to the 10 right, they voted between 7 and 10. And here, even if the region is Lombardy, the most affected region, those have a negative parameter estimate. So, which means that they are more prone to opening respect to the reference. Then the only positive parameter, so which means that they are more prone to continue the lockdown, are those living in the two provinces of Bergamo and Brescia, which are in Lombardy and which have been the two most affected provinces. But those people who have said that they perceived a sanitary crisis. Here we have tested two types of questions. Those who have perceived a sanitary crisis, and the coefficient is very significant, and those who have perceived in economic crisis. But in that case, that variable was not significant. Then young people are more prone to opening. And Pierangelo, that's why your son went to the seaside, you know. They read our figures. And another explanation of what you said at the beginning, you know, that yesterday there was this sort of a parade in Rome organized by sovereignist and by right party. You know, they read our numbers, and so that's why they did what they did yesterday. So another group, those who are high educated, are more prone to opening, and also those who have higher levels of income. However, the dummy of high education and the dummy of high level of income are in our sample very highly correlated. So if we insert one of them, the other comes to be not significant anymore. Then those individuals who are in the labor market, so both employees and self-employed, even those who have a precarious job, are all of them, and with a similar propensity, prone to reopening. And finally, this interesting variable, COVID-19 conspiracy. This is a 7 items multidimensional score asking respondents about the plausibility of statements reporting conspiracy. So some conspiracy theories regarding the origin, the spread, and the containment of COVID-19. And of course, here the value, the sign of the estimate is negative, so they are more prone to opening. So I go very, very quickly to these penultimate models. Here we have eliminated all the geographical dummies, but we have inserted these continuous variable that's relative. So this is the number of deaths per million inhabitants. That's why it's relative at a regional level. So here we can see that, for instance, Lombardy, which has a higher level of deaths per million inhabitants, still, this value is still negative, even if the level is only 90%, so it's not very, very significant. Finally, we wanted to focus on the effect of the treatment on sovereignists, so those who are voting North League or Fratelli d'Italia, so the extreme right. So we ran a full regression model in which, on top of the 3 treatments, we add only that control variable, no other control variables, and its interaction with the treatment. And here, what comes out is that the effect of the treatment is higher and still significant on the rest of the population, while the effect of the treatment is much lower on those respondents. This, what is the meaning? This implies that for those that identify themselves as sovereignist, the effect of a framing in the treatments is much less effective. So those who are subject to this tend to be much more sticky on their opinions. So that is important. Well, just for concluding my presentation, we now expect some good suggestions from you. And that's all for my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
So, Gianni, thank you very much also to you for this presentation. I haven't received actually many questions from people who want to intervene, so I'm asking somebody or someone to break the ice before others maybe can join us. Is there anyone who wants to start? Pierangelo wants to break the ice. Of course you can. So.
Okay, this is a breaking ice question, so not particularly insightful or meaningful. But this is a question for Jordi and his team, and to a certain extent also for us, because I mean, in your data and also in the survey we ran, of course, we ran only one was a cross-sectional survey. We found two different and to me a bit contradictory pieces of evidence. On the one hand, I think you also found that there was support for the government strategies in dealing with the COVID-19. From my understanding, in your question, the question was whether it was more appropriate for the government to address this issue than for the European Union. In our case, we asked about the support for what the government had done. And we found, by the way, also in a short paper that appeared in a blog, we found a drastic increase in the amount of support for the government and trust in what government was doing. So on the one hand, there is what we could call, probably not is a proper description, but a sort of rally around the institution. On the other hand, you found that those who were more affected by the crisis, by the health crisis, were also those who were less trustful of the government and less inclined to support the government. So my question for you, and to a certain extent is also for me, is how to reconcile these two different things. On the one hand, people seems to get closer to the government. On the other hand, people seem to be, especially those who are more severely hit, less trustful of the government. And I have a second and last question. I would be interested in knowing whether what we found in Italy, and by the way, also others have found in the United States, meaning a huge difference between left and right in the way they read the crisis and they behave accordingly, is also found in Spain. Thank you very much.
Shall I respond now?
Yeah, please go ahead, Jordi.
Okay. So thank you for the questions. I do think they are insightful. So regarding the first question, I have not shown these results here, but we also had some questions on agreement and support for the specific measures taken by the government in Spain, and we found that most people at that moment was asking for stronger measures for the government. So they were critical with what the government was doing, but in that moment, the critique was that the government was not doing enough. So they thought they were to relax the measures at the moment. So our reading of this evidence is that people was demanding like a strong leader, strong power, and the central government seems to be like the best candidate in this case, rather than either the regions or the European Union. So, and this doesn't mean that people were like strongly supportive of the specific actions the government was taking at the moment, but they were like demanding strong leadership, strong power in a way. This is how we interpret this. And this is something that might have changed, and this is also why we are running like a new wave to observe this, whether now the critique is that the government is too strict rather than too relaxed in its management of the crisis, and whether the ideological divide appears. So my intuition is that there is, well, my intuition, that what we are seeing in the streets in Madrid, for example, are also far-right wing demonstrations now. And this was not happening at the moment in which we ran our first survey. So probably the ideological polarization in the preferences and support for the government and so on and so forth is something that has been unfolding and developing over time, over the course of these 2 months. So, and this is something we sort of think it's going to be interesting to capture, like on real time, how the politicization and polarization around an issue emerges in the public opinion. So there were very minor differences between left and right in the moment in which we ran the first survey. Of course, the voters of the government parties had more positive views on what the government had done, but nothing like especially surprising. The ideological divide we are seeing in other countries, I think, will come up in Spain now, but we will see in the third wave.
So, Gianni, do you want to add something about it?
Thank you.
Okay, otherwise we have two more questions, one from Mattia and the other one from Andreu. So Mattia goes first and then Andreu. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. My point is very much related to what Pierangelo said regarding the extent to which this support for a national response it reflects a temporary support for the leadership of the country that is just showing itself during the worst moment of the crisis, and then it disappears. And talking about this, I was interested in knowing if you had measured in your survey, or maybe if you said that and I missed you, I apologize. If you had measured support for the president in the first wave and in the second wave, to compare as a way to let's say to discriminate to what extent these feelings can be attributed to a rally around the flag, in which, if that is the case, the literature says that it should be temporary. Then we are all in uncharted territory. So I wouldn't trust too much what the past literature says, but yeah, this was my question. Thank you.
So thank you, Mattia. So maybe Jordi can answer the question and then we leave the floor to Andreu.
Okay, so two questions, two answers. Sorry, the first one is that in the baseline wave in January, we didn't have an explicit measure of support for the president or the government. We had closeness to the parties, okay, and we didn't find much movement in either direction in the second wave. But again, this is something I think it's going to be interesting to look in the third wave, because this is when the political polarization kicks in my opinion, or at least this is our hypothesis. Regarding whether the effects are temporary or not, I think this is also an open question that we're trying to address with this design of several successive ways, and I think so. For a different project with Albert, we have been looking at the effects of the terrorist attacks from the Basque group ETA in Spain, and there we found this very clear pattern of a short-term rally around the flag effect and a long-term negative effect on support for the incumbent. So there seems to be reasons to expect something along these lines, right? Maybe things will be much quicker now because today everything moves super fast. But yeah, this is also what we kind of expect. But yeah, we run our survey very fast right after the lockdown. So it was just 5 days after the state of emergency was declared in Spain that we entered the field. So these results I have discussed here have to be interpreted need to be interpreted as the immediate reaction of the public, and probably the comparison with the longer term reaction will be more illuminating in this sense.
Thank you, Jordi. And so, Andreo, now is your turn if you have a question. Andreo, can you hear me? If Andreo cannot hear us, so maybe Jordi, you can ask the question you had in mind.
Okay, so no, I just want. So I really think this health versus wealth approach is super interesting and insightful. And I was wondering, in a way, to what extent. So two questions, or yeah, two or three questions. Two questions actually. One, whether you think so, whether it would be a problem that it's more difficult to manipulate the health than the economic effects of the crisis, in the sense that people have much more information on the daily counts of deaths and occupation of hospitals and so on and so forth. And this is something that has been happening and has perhaps already happened. But the economic impact is something we still do not fully appreciate. So people, in a way, people are much more pre-treated when it comes to the health effects than the wealth effects. The second question is somehow related, and is that I think it would be interesting. I don't know exactly the nuts and bolts of your design, but it would be interesting to try to estimate a coefficient for health consequences and the coefficient for economic consequences, to sort of estimate the elasticity, so to speak, in the sense that to see whether people are more responsive to increased negative economic or health consequences in terms of their attitudes. And I don't know if this is something you can do with your design, that separating the two dimensions, instead of showing a coefficient combining the health and the economic treatments, because I think it would be interesting, and also it would be interesting to interact these treatments with the characteristics of the individuals, like ideology or the other all these characteristics you showed as control variables in the models, which have very interesting findings. And I was wondering whether interacting them systematically with the treatments would be informative in terms of this health versus wealth dilemma.
Thank you, Jordi. So, Gianni, do you want to reply, please, to Jordi's question?
Gianni left. He's probably, instead of pushing the right button, he pushed the
Sorry,
Gianni,
I pushed the wrong button.
I know, I imagine. It happens all the time to me.
So I would like to maybe answer to one question of Jordi, and maybe I can also answer to one question of Pierangelo. So the two questions from Jordi. So to estimate the elasticities of health and wealth and so on. Well, in reality, we are not. We have not designed the experiment exactly for that. We wanted to put more than these four scenarios. So include in the randomization many more different values of number of deaths, of number of beds in the intense therapy, different level of loss of jobs and so on. We didn't do that, but however, with those 4 combinations, we are still able to estimate something. I already started to estimate some models, but we decided not to include in this first draft of the paper because we have decided to have a short paper for some reasons. So for the moment, we want to stick with the short paper. Plan B will be to have a longer paper, okay? But we, well, for the other question, probably as being a statistician, I'm not the right person to answer your question. Maybe I ask some help from my co-authors for answering. But then I would like to go back to the question of Pierangelo that was posed to Jordi and also to our group. So also in Italy, we have observed in the sample that many respondents were in favor of the government actions. But this was not from the more affected regions, in my opinion, mainly because of political reasons. We know that in Lombardy and in Veneto and partially in Piedmont, the voters are more towards the right wing, and especially in those 3 regions, the North League and so the sovereignists are quite strong. So the support or not support to the government was, in my opinion, mainly based by political reasons. And we have seen in all these, in all the models that we have estimated. So in Lombardy, they are even much in favor of reopening, where there were almost half of the deaths in Italy concentrating in one single region.
Jordi, do you want to reply to Gianni, or is there anyone who wants to add something with respect to what Gianni just said? If not, Andreu now is back with us and he can speak and ask.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm using my iPad and I don't know what I messed up that I couldn't speak, but thank you. Very interesting presentation. So I was wondering whether it could be interesting. So in these scenarios, I see that there can be an element of preference and also an element of belief about the likelihood of the different variables, maybe, of thinking that it's possible. So I don't know if it could be interesting to explore these, or I don't know if you have thought about whether what is the role of preference and whether there's a role of beliefs on how likely the scenarios can be and so on. So this was my question.
Gianni, you would like?
Yeah, what do you mean for the role of beliefs? Sorry, I am a statistician, so sometimes some words or some I'm not so familiar.
No, I mean when respondents see a scenario, whether the fact that they think that it's more or less likely that it's gonna happen, it makes them like so changes their behavior or their responses.
May I say something? Gianni, go ahead, then I say something on
yes,
this.
but I don't know. I'm not familiar. Yeah, I'm not familiar, but maybe we should have asked, we should have asked something, but we have not asked on, what is your expectation? Do you think that there will be 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000? But we didn't ask that. We just proposed two alternative scenarios. This is the Bible, If you choose these, so the reopening, there will be 10,000 deaths. And that's true. You don't have to believe or not on that. So maybe in the experiment that we did, we did not ask, how are you confident with this number? If you really believe in this number. Correct, Pierangelo? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you are not wrong. In fact, we didn't check for how trustful they were in either the data or their own answer to the question. So, but this is this is something we are interested in exploring further. In fact, we decided to play with this experiment because we have another incoming survey in September, and we would like to go a bit deeper on this, having found that there are important differences in the way people react to these different framings of the management of the post severe outbreak crisis. The only thing that comes to my mind we could do, but unfortunately we were not smart enough in designing the questions, was that this experiment is then followed by the Kahneman and Tversky experiment that is all about framing. So what we could do is to see whether those who are more likely to be exposed to the framing of the Kahneman experiment react differently to the different scenarios. But as I said, we have not been smart enough because unfortunately the Kahneman experiment comes next and not before. That of course would have made this analysis
always happens.
yeah. So I mean, my fault. I can take full responsibility for that. But so this is this is what comes to my mind. But just to conclude, there is an indirect answer to your question, and is the coefficient on conspiracy. I mean, the coefficient on conspiracy very powerfully shows that no matter what kind of scenarios you submit, opening is the answer for those who think that this is all an hoax.
Okay, I see. Okay, because another question. So now I'm thinking related to this. How did you pick the numbers? Like, did you the numbers like for the different scenarios?
Okay.
How? Yeah.
Okay. These are not picked up at random. We did some study, and that's the reason why Gianni and Paolo came in, because they helped us. I'm not an economist. I'm not a statistician. I have I always say this story. I have a wife that is a biologist, and she helped me to figure out the number of ICU that could be affected. By the way, the number of ICU has been computed by an average ICU occupation in normal time. So what we did was basically computed what was the pressure on ICU based on the experience in Italy as compared to a standard situation. But for the others, we relied upon some computations on which we trust our economies. I cannot say they are fully realistic, but at least one of these scenarios for May was not too much out of target, because at the end of the day, May went more or less like the scenario B something. I don't remember if B1 or B2 went. So we had approximately, if I remember correctly, 2,000, a bit more than 2,000 deaths.
I see. No, because I'm thinking, so if these numbers are computed according to like a model which like is in line with what you would expect that most people understand, like from the data that they get and so on, then I think so. This is maybe that, I mean, they see. So if there is a bit of a consensus because these numbers are produced using like the usual predictions and so on, there is less room for differences in thinking that this will never, like, I'm thinking, someone thinking this will never happen, that we will get these figures. So because if this is taken like consistently from a model or whatever, and
yes,
then it shouldn't be so different from what they are getting through the media, maybe different projections and so on, which we have been seeing during these weeks.
Yes, we had in mind some models in the mid-April, more or less, when we discussed these issue, and we made 2 or 3 cases where, you know, the distribution was flattering for more time, or for what was going down quicker. So in fact we had 2-point estimates, and then we decided to take the interval, in taking the 2 extremes of the 2 intervals for the hard and mild scenario A and hard and mild scenario B. So that in fact they were not completely at random, as I said, Pierangelo. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, good.
I think also Cristiano had to say something about these numbers and estimations.
I have 2 points to raise exactly on this issue. And one is like, I'm happy to do this, like when Pierangelo is here listening and participating, because I do remember so well a presentation, I really like it, back in 2010 in Venice at the CISP conference, and it was about the misperception of the percentages of immigrants in different countries.
Yeah, and so, I was thinking,
yeah. And one thing I would like to say about these numbers is that they can be very realistic, but the matter of fact is that the way people understand them. So I can give a very precise value on the potential loss in GDP, but people do not even have a far idea of what is 600 billion, million, or whatever. And if you look at your elements in your scenario, you have death that has like a ratio 10:1, the highest to the smallest. Then you have GDP that has a ratio of 24:1, from the highest to the lowest. Then you have like losing jobs, like unemployment, that is like infinite, because it's 600,000 to 0, so that is like infinite. And then you have ICU that is like 13:1. So the thing is like you can make very precise estimates on real data, but what we have is that most of the time people are not so well informed on those numbers, or as Jordi was saying, they can be differently informed on those numbers. So like someone can say something about how many people are going to die and some other not. So this is like it's really difficult. I acknowledge your difficulties and your attempt to have like good scenarios to measure that, but still like with a lot of question marks on how people get that. And the second point, go back to a point that made Jordi, but that I think it deserves more attention, because like the title of the presentation is Health versus Wealth. But then when you see that one specific scenario that is like the mild scenario is the one that is preferred for openings, the question remains whether this preference is influenced by the fact that you have less debt in difference, or you lose less jobs in difference, or you have like a minor difference in the budget of the states, in the loss of the states, or in the ICU. So I can see that mild is the preferred options for opening and to leave the lockdown, but still I don't know whether it's because people do see that as a mild situation or a small difference in terms of health or in terms of wealth. That's it.
So who wants to answer to Cristiano? Angelo or Gianni? Or both?
Well, I don't know how to answer, but I think that are very good comments, and maybe we could incorporate these comments for next survey in September, Pierangelo. So maybe introducing, some question on how is the perception of respondents of the figures, of the numbers that we show them, and maybe after that try to incorporate this perception into the model.
I agree, although I also cannot. I mean, I don't know how to answer to Cristiano's comments, if not remembering that he's coming from a region in which the person in charge of the health of that region is not able to understand that R less than 0 does not mean that you need 2 persons to get infected. But so in Lombardy, they might have bigger problem with statistics than in other regions. No, but beside this joke, no, clearly, I mean, there might be ways of circumventing it. I see 2 challenges, and this is one of the reasons why shifting the question to our Spanish friends, we would be also interested in generalizing this kind of consideration to other countries. Clearly, the situation in September will be different from the situation now. I mean, we exploited a very peculiar moment in the Italian history, because the survey took place between the 24th and 28th. The government announced on the 26th that we were going to open starting May 3rd. And so immediately a flurry of comments and analysis and considerations came out. By the way, this might be interesting to show, because we could see whether between those who has been interviewed before and after there is a difference, but this is a consideration among us. So I don't know whether we will be able to replicate such a perfect window of opportunity again, because of course what's going to happen in September we don't know. Maybe that we will all on the seaside and the virus will be disappeared, as somebody, again, always in Lombardy, claims, some physicians from Lombardy claims, or maybe we are back into a lockdown. So I think that this is a bit hard to manage again, to replicate again, but this is clearly something that we would encourage, if you want and you can, to include also in something similar in your own survey, to see whether what works for Italy works also for Spain. On the other end, we are also interested, I have to say, in your argument about the negative impact that the COVID might have been on not only trust in democracy, but also the feeling that democracy might not be the most appropriate way of dealing with this kind of challenges. In the survey we did, we had a question in which was a statement, was a Likert scale statement, saying something like that: the COVID-19 outbreak has shown that that liberal democracy are unable to deal with this kind of things. And if I remember correctly, more than 2/3 of the sample answered yes. So this is something on which we might be interested in going deeper, because of course would be very worrisome for democracy, for the health of democracy, beside the health of the citizens, for the health of democracy to conduct, to have such a public opinion orientation. I mean, I cannot add more to what Cristiano said, because all he said is correct. I'm happy that he enjoyed my presentation on innumeracy 7 years ago. When I hope he will enjoy the next one if it's based on this bit. 10 years ago, okay.
No, it's like just to come back. They were comments because I think the outcomes are brilliant and they are very effective, and with some other additional control on kind of let's say resources like skills and so. Then you would have maybe a further check on how much reliable is the answer of the person, but the results are brilliant, of course. Yeah.
So thank you very much. I think also Francesco Mastroni had a quick comment on this issue. I think the issue of how people perceive numbers or understand numbers. So Francesco, if you can hear us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you. I share this comment. How the information is received and processed and then transformed into a preference in this scenario. Rightly, we didn't include any manipulation check. This could be a problem, and we didn't measure preferences in a scale. We could have both. Sorry, there's my kid. I don't know if you hear. We asked respondents to choose one of the two scenario, but we didn't ask the likelihood he or she prefer each of these scenarios. So we didn't have this kind of measurements. But I think that it's true that it's based on how the respondents are, their familiarity with some concepts, or also maybe we can measure some proxies. For instance, we can use, level of education, whether they are low or high in the conspiracy index. So as proxies on how people actually process this kind of information, or are more or less likely to accept certain scenarios. But I think we are, by relying on the experimental environment, we can be quite familiar that these people should be spread across all the different conditions. So if there is a problem of perception of how people elaborate this kind of information, well, you should have the same problem in all four scenarios. So you should not find a statistically significant result if this is the case. but there are some significant results instead that show that certain people process information and base their judgments on different criteria. So I mean, I share this command or this warning about the way people process information, elaborate them, and turn them into a preference. But at the same time, we can be quite confident about the fact that this is an experimental setting, so that they should be spread across all the different treatment conditions.
So thank you very much, Francesco. Is there anyone who wants to add something, reply to Francesco, or ask a new question? So we are a 4:45, so we are approaching, heading the end of the seminar. So I don't have an actual question because most of them have been already raised. I have only a general comment. So I really like both the presentations. I think that this was a very stimulating session, and we actually succeeded to in our aim. I express, and hope. So for more collaboration and ideas, and both of us are going to conduct surveys, new waves of panel, both during the summer and on September. So hopefully we are going to share ideas and maybe also collaborating together in a research project. So I want to thank all the participants and Jordi and Gianni in particular for the presentation. And if there is no other questions, I would just end the seminar here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, and let's keep in contact.
Let's keep in touch. Exactly.
Yeah, tomorrow afternoon, 4 o'clock.
Okay, and Jordi, we will send you Jordi and the Spanish team. We will send you the presentation, and we will tell you what are our next plans. If there is any way we can coordinate efforts, that would be the most welcome, because Spain and Italy have been the two most affected, but less stupid than the British. So it could be useful to study them as a test bed for many different hypotheses.
Okay, yes. I think we should at least, at the minimum, perhaps share some wordings of some questions in the two countries, so we can have like comparable data. So yeah, we should definitely talk more about this.
Okay, I think we will have time, and when we have a clear idea on what's going to happen in the next survey, we can share what we are doing with you, and you can give us your feedback.
Okay, we will do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye now. Thank you, Sergio and Mattia. Bye bye.
Thank you, Sergio. Ciao.
Bye bye. Ciao.